Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the late start. I'm just going to share my screen right away. Just give me 1 second. And can you guys see that? Yeah. All right, so welcome to our ABC meeting. Today we're reporting back to the public on input received and ministry funding. So our meeting today takes place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian Nation and Smilik speaking people. It is a privilege to work, live, and play on this land. And today is actually a special day in which School District 52 signed a local education agreement with the Metlakatla Band. So here's our agenda of what we'll be going over today. So we'll go over the budget meeting date schedule. Then Superintendent Andrew Samuel will give a quick recap of our strategic plan. Afterwards, we'll go over the enrollment trends. Next, we'll discuss the operating grant. We'll go over the increases as well as provide some comparisons. Agenda item number 5 is when we'll go over where we expect to be at the end of the current year in terms of our reserves. Then next, I'll go over the new Indigenous Education Council support funding. Then I'll provide an update on the student and family affordability funding. And agenda item 8 is when I'll share the input we received from the public regarding our 24-25 budget. Then I'll go over our next steps, and afterwards we will open it up for questions. So this is the planned budget consultation meeting that's approved by the board. The intention of today's meeting is to report back to the public on input received, as well as provide information on ministry funding. And now I'll pass it over to Superintendent Andrew Samuel to give a quick recap of our strategic plan, as this is important to keep in mind throughout the budget process.
Thank you, Brittany. Yes, it's just a reminder that over the next few weeks, as certainly as Brittany and her staff prepare budgets, we want to just remind everyone that that our priorities are based on the foundational document, which is the strategic plan. And in our strategic plan, our priorities are equity, and that is to eliminate the achievement gap between our students. And since we're now the Ministry of Education and Childcare, that is students from birth to 19 years of age. And this includes all of the children in our schools today. How do we do that? We do that with a focus on literacy and numeracy. And as you have often heard me say, and as we spoke at the Metlakatla LEA signing agreement today, we talked about that achievement gap starts way back in elementary. And that means our goal of having our students generally being able to read at a grade 3 level by the end of grade 3. Secondly, our budgeting process is there to also reflect the Truth and Reconciliation program that we have, and the work that we're doing on Truth and Reconciliation, which is all staff have a part in that. And we work with our rights holders in the Indigenous Education Department. We work with the community, and that is to strengthen our commitment to Truth and Reconciliation and to make decisions that support that. And lastly, mental health literacy. We know that things like COVID did affect our community greatly, and we're seeing those effects now. And we know that mental health literacy is very, very important for all of our students. It doesn't just include students, it also includes staff. And so our budget should reflect those things that the board believes in and the board has created in the strategic plan. So these are the things that help us, the foundational document that helps us make decisions over the next 4 or 5 weeks. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you, Andrew. So now let's go over the operating grant. The obvious starting point is enrollment, as it drives the bulk of revenues and expenses. Looking at this chart, you can see that our enrollment has been relatively stable for the last 4 to 5 years. One of our first steps in the budget was to determine what enrollment looks like for next year. This is an overview of our operating grant funding from the ministry. This is the basis for building our budget. The first section is our current 23-24 amended. The second section is our next year 24-25 preliminary. And this third section is the change between the two. On the far left, we listed the different categories that are included in the funding formula. For example, K-12, alternate school, and homeschool. In each section, there's a column for the student FTE, the rate per FTE, and the total in dollars. You can see that this chart is broken down into 3 categories. This top section up here is the basic allocation. The middle section are the unique student needs allocation, and the bottom section are the unique district allocation. This will be important later on when we discuss some funding allocations. And so just going through the list, I won't go through it all in detail, but I'll just pull out a couple examples. So if we look at the top row, kindergarten to grade 12, you can see that our FTE for the 23-24 amended budget was 1,783.5. And for the next year preliminary is 1,775. And then on the far right, that's a difference of 8.5 decrease. And then you can just go along. So with the rate, it was 8,625. Preliminary for next year is 8,915. That is a difference of 290. And total dollars, that's 441,000. We wanted to also point out that although it looks like overall we are receiving additional funding of 293,000 at the bottom far right-hand corner. However, this is more than offset by the wage increases that are effective July 1st. I also wanted to point out that on the bottom of this listing is the Indigenous Education Council, IEC funding, and this is new this year, or sorry, next year. I will speak to this later on tonight. And for those of you in person, that chart is actually on the last page of your handout. So next I'll go over the operating grant increases. All the per student funding amounts were increased by around 3.4% to cover the wage increases. The top table on this slide shows the details of this. The bottom table shows the details of the ministry funding that is not based on student count. These items had a total increase ranging from 0 to 3.8%. This averaged out to less than 1%. This creates inequities for smaller rural districts. This slide illustrates how the funding for the wage increases was applied to a small rural district like ours, compared to a larger school district such as Surrey. This is broken down into the 3 components, which if you recall, I mentioned on the first operating grant slide I presented. The pie graph on the left is our school district, and the one on the right is the Surrey School District. The blue section is the basic allocation of ministry funding. This represents 60% of our budget and 78% of Surrey's. The orange section is the unique student needs allocation of ministry funding. This represents 21% of our budget and 19% of Surrey's. And the gray section is the unique district allocation of ministry funding. This section is mainly calculated on individual district geographic characteristics, which is particularly important to small rural districts like ours. This represents 18% of our budget and only 2% of Surrey's. There is also another section of small amounts included that make up less than 1% and doesn't show up on this graph. This includes things such as summer school and curriculum and learning support. So on this slide, we have added to the bottom how the funding for wage increases have been applied to the ministry operating grant. So the ministry applied a 3.4% increase to the portion of funding we receive for the basic allocation factor and the unique student needs factor. As a reminder, the basic allocation is the base amount we receive for each K-12 student. The unique student needs allocation is the supplements for special needs students, Indigenous education students, etc. Both of these amounts are based on a per student calculation, which is the same for every school district in the province. For example, a special needs student receives the same amount of funding in Rupert as they would in Surrey. Surrey just has a lot more of them. Where the ministry differentiates between Prince Rupert School District and Surrey School District is in the unique district funds. This funding takes into account the fact that it is much more expensive to run a small high school in Rupert versus a large high school in Surrey. You can see that in the two graphs on this slide, where the unique district funding is 18% of our operating grant, it's only 2% of Surrey's. Unfortunately, the funding for wage increases was not applied equally to all three segments. The student funding, the blue and orange sections of the pie, received 3.4% increases. The gray section of the pie received considerably less. What this means is that for 81% of our funding, we received a 3.4% increase. For the other 19%, we received less than 1%. On the other hand, for Surrey, they received a lower funding percentage for the gray segment, but that only represents 2% of their funding. As you can see here, they received full funding at 3.4% for 98% of their operating grant, while we received full funding of 3.4% on only 81% of our operating grant. On average, Surrey received a 3.3% overall increase, and Rupert received a 2.9% overall increase.
Wow.
This works out to about $118,000 difference for our district, and this is cumulative, meaning it'll happen every year. Next, we'll go over our reserves again. You're probably fairly familiar with this slide now, as I've shown it a few times, but we'll just go over it again tonight. So as we look at our finances for next year, it's important to look at what reserves we have available. We start off with the current year shortfall, which is budgeted at $447,000. However, we received a reimbursement of our prior middle school project planning cost of $1.055 million. This brings us to our current budgeted surplus of $607,000. Then we can also add our unrestricted reserve from the beginning of the year of $237,000. This then brings us to our budgeted reserve balance of $845,000. As a reminder, our board policy is to have between 2 to 4% as a contingency. This will be about $500,000 to $1 million. Again, these are not actual figures as we are still in the 23-24 year, and these are just estimates at this time. As I mentioned in the beginning of today's presentation, new next year is Indigenous Education Council support funding. So tonight we want to go over the information we currently have regarding it. This funding is to help support the implementation of IECs. Each district will receive the $50,000 base grant amount. In addition to this, there is also $9,250 per First Nation located within the district's boundaries, as well as a rural factor adjustment. The principles of the funding allocation are that each district will require a base level of funding. The complexity of the operations of an IEC may be affected by the number of First Nations a school district is interacting with, and that travel to provincial meetings, if necessary, will be more costly for rural districts. Our school district's IEC support funding will be $72,790 next year. The ministry will be providing us with more information, such as how these funds are to be spent at a later date. Next, we want to also include some information regarding the student and family affordability funding. Last month, the ministry announced that in the current 23-24 school year, they are adding $20 million to the student and family affordability funding. Our school district's share of this additional funding is $100,000. This is considered one-time funding. And to recap our district's student, family, and affordability funding, the ministry started this funding last year in 22-23, and our district received $250,000. $195,000 was unspent at the end of June last year and was carried over to our current year, 23-24. In the current year, we also received the additional $100,000, which I just mentioned. Carryover from the current year to next year is anticipated. We also want to remind you that this student and family affordability funding is special purpose funding. Although it's additional funding, there are guidelines that we are required to follow on how we spend these funds. We include this slide in tonight's meeting as it's additional funding that the ministry announced last month, which will be received in the current year, but is expected to be carried over to next year. We also wanted to mention again tonight that we tend to not discuss too much about our special purpose funds. This is because we don't have control over how this funding is spent. The agencies that provide the funding have specified what it is to be spent on. Next, we'll go over the public input received. Per our district's annual budget policy, number 7210, opportunities will be provided for meaningful input from all partner groups concerned with school district's operations as set out in the regulation attached to the policy. This slide is a listing of the input and suggestions we received from the public. This also includes suggestions provided at a working session we held on April 2nd with the board, senior staff, principals, and vice principals. So I'm just going to go through this listing that's on your slide. So the first one was more innovative ways to teach using less paper, transportation costs, more creative ways to cover prep time, 4-day work week with 5th day paid childcare in schools, sell properties, rental Charles Hayes Auto Shop, more international students, examine school cleaning needs, and adding a basketball academy. I just want to note as well that other suggestions were included, but they weren't included in tonight's presentation just due to their sensitivity. For example, specific positions. Next steps. So here's the schedule again for the annual budget consultation, ABC meeting dates. The intention of today's meeting is to report back to the public on input received, as well as provide information on ministry funding. The next scheduled meeting is our regular open meeting on May 21st at 7 p.m. And I'd like to open it up for any questions.
I got a question, Brittany, if I can.
Yep.
So, with the change of our next year's schedule, you had it at 293,264. But you had said that that would change, due to the unique districts, the 18% not being fully covered, right? Is that?
No, that number shouldn't change. That
No,
293.
so we're looking then, so 293 is a surplus.
So this is just operating funds. So this, so that number 293 on the far right-hand column,
Mhm.
that's actually just the change between the first section, so the 23-24 amended. So the current year,
Right,
and the change for next year's.
and it says including labor settlement, right?
Yeah.
So that's everything included. The money that's coming in is the 25.8, right?
Yes,
Right,
sorry.
okay.
Yeah.
And so if I'm looking at our amended budget, if everything stayed the same, then we would still be up to 293, right? Am I not looking at that correctly? Plus the 800,000 that we are still in the positive at the end of this year.
If I'm understanding correctly, so this is just operating, so we're not taking into account expenses.
Right.
So, yeah, so as I mentioned, so the 293,000, that's just regarding our operating grant, but it's gonna be offset or more than offset by the wage increases next year. So that doesn't even cover our wage increases.
Oh, okay, so the wage increase is not included in the labor settlement.
So this is just the funding. So
It's
the
just the
expense
funding.
isn't included in here. So this slide is just funding coming in.
It's just,
Nothing to
okay,
do
so
with-
we're not actually looking at Okay, just
Does
wanted
that
to make
help?
sure, yeah, it does. Just wanted to make sure I grasped it.
Another question, this 118,000 that you spoke of every year, that now needs to come out of our operating as well, correct? If we go back to these, the operating grant increase,
Yeah, so basically we would expect, we're shortfall basically at that amount.
like, so what in my head is like, we know we're gonna be down 111 because of,
Funding protection?
thank you, funding protection. And then so another given is this 118, like before we even start, is what we're looking at in shortfall, correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good
Like,
way to
I mean,
look at
that's
it.
only two of the
Yeah.
many, but to know for sure those are two.
That's a bit tricky so that number is just the wage increase settlement funding that we're not receiving.
Right. So it will be dependent on what it looks like our staffing is at the
Yeah.
time as well.
Yeah. Any other questions?
That goes to anybody online as well.
I have one, Kate. So I'm a little confused here, Brittany. So 118 and what you say, I'm just adding this up in 112. So we've completely exhausted our funding now, our funding protection. That should be removed from this year's budget. So I'm assuming the 118 plus the 112. So we really don't know what the impact of the wage increase is because this is only actually for is this just for teachers and principals, or is this teachers, principals, and senior staff? Like, what's included in that shortfall there?
Jerry, do you want to speak to that one?
Sure. No, what we're showing there, that 293,000 is the increase to cover wage settlement funding according to the ministry's formula. We just felt that was the way it's calculated because of the items that Brittany presented, is that Surrey receiving, an average of 3.3%, and your district receiving an average of 2.9% increase because of the way they've calculated it. So that's just an item that we felt if it had been done fairly, you would have received $118,000 more. So that 293 would have been closer to $400,000 increase and would have come closer to actually covering the cost of your wage increases for next year. Does
Thank
that
you
make
for that,
sense?
Sarah. Yeah, I pretty much understand it. I mean, the only thing I have I take issue with is comparing our district to Surrey. I would actually like to compare our district to maybe a school district in the north, like Prince George, to see what the difference in formulas would be there. Just because we're in the north, like Surrey, I already know what North Van gets. I would know what Surrey gets. So, I would like to see something more in the line of the rural area that would have a larger population like Prince George.
Janet, I actually did this calculation for my own district,
Okay.
Fraser, which is a small rural, even more spread out than Rupert.
Okay.
And we're impacted even more than this because our
Oh, wow.
our unique district factors are 21% of our budget. That's what started us looking at this. So it would be
Okay.
similar for Prince George. It would be similar for Nechako Lakes. For any of the rural districts, they would be the same. They have a huge part of their budget is the unique district factors. And the ministry
Right.
just hasn't taken that into account because they feel that there's no wage cost involved in that, which is crazy because a big
Crazy.
piece of it is just for busing. And,
Right.
so it's it's a bit of a frustration that, for at a time when the districts are struggling to balance the budget, that, they've got a funding wage increase formula that's just not working for rural districts.
No, thank you for that, Jerry.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just for right now, we have no idea what we're tracking at then for our upcoming budget. Is that what we're seeing?
So we're still working on that this week, so we should have a good idea next week.
And questions are from anybody, right? Not
Yeah,
just that.
I think
Questions
so.
are from anyone, not just trustees.
So open to the public as well. On Zoom, feel free to raise your hand. Or just unmute yourself, if that's easier. Oh. Sage.
Yeah, hey, sorry I can't be there in person, but that room is way too bright for me right now. So, my question, I guess, is this. So at the AGM not that long ago, I brought exactly this up, that this funding model is broken for smaller districts and more things, but that was definitely the specific one. And I saw a lot of nodding around the room of the small districts, like instantly a lot of nodding. And then the larger districts just sort of seemed like confused about what are you talking? I guess I'm just wondering, the trustees collectively, like your provincial body, education ministry, like what's the flavor of the meeting? Like, are the trustees of Surrey taking this seriously at all, in your opinion, or not at all? And provincially, do they have any better answers than, well, that funding's just for buses? Like, has there been any sort of response provincially or from the trustees association that this is a real unfair, like your slide was very clear to me and I can't see how anyone would look at that slide and not realize how unfair this is. So I'm just question for everyone, kind of.
So, oh, sorry, Chair Toy will speak to that.
Thanks. Thank you, Sage. As you and I have spoken before, we are pushing at BCSTA from this district all the time for equity. And Trustee Horn has brought forward talk of a motion that he would like to see come forward for this specific operating grant. And it will be in discussion at the board meeting next week. And then our BCSTA GM is next week as well. So we would like to see this go forward as a substantive or an emergent motion, and we'll see what happens at the AGM.
Thank you for that.
Jerry also has been doing a lot of work on this as well, and I can see that he has his hand raised, so I think he'll speak to that as well.
Yeah, we
The one
actually have
thing, Jerry, the one comment I do have about the issue around busing. I mean, we can say all we want that we're, the extra funds are for busing, but we both know under the School Act, there's no obligation of school boards to provide busing. So, when we look at this, we have to really kind of shake our head, because we were in the same position several years ago where we had to eliminate busing, and it caused a real conflict between the smaller communities, i.e. Port Ed, the Metlakatla people getting to and from schools from the ferry. And we had to fight tooth and nail to get a bit of, through recourse, we got a bit of extra funding, but the equity is not there. And the ministry has to recognize that we all don't live in an urban center. We all don't have, 10,000 students attending school. And hopefully, I mean, we've been going around in a circle with this many years at BCSTA to try to prove like that, we need the support, but it just hasn't happened. And let's try to keep pushing. And Sage had great, insight on it's very clear when you look at the pie chart how unfair it really is.
Yeah,
Um,
what
before-
I'd wanted to say was that we have our board meetings tomorrow at Fraser Cascade, and we've got a letter coming from our board chair. It's going to the whole board tomorrow night for approval. That's going to write to the minister exactly on this issue. And I had already spoken with the ministry staff about it, because they don't really understand that these are labor costs, these unique district things. It's not, we don't use more toilet paper or pencils per student up here. What we have is more staffing per student. Those are wages that come out of that, not supplies. A little bit maybe more for heat or utilities, but the bulk of it is wages. And so they've got to apply the wage settlement funding equally to all of the funding, not just to little pieces of it. So anyway,
Yeah,
our board will be complaining, so.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, Jerry. I just wanted to speak, just a comment regarding Janet's comments. So the transportation for Metlakatla is actually covered through a special purpose grant on BCT. So it's not part of this.
Tripartite.
Yeah. So it's not part of the operating grant.
It's provincial, federal, and that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions?
I just have sort of maybe a comment / question, which is like, we have things like the Northern Retention Allowance, which also gets a 3.3 increase and everything else. Is that factored in all of this as well? Because that is a cost that is specific to these districts we're talking about. Are they factoring in the fact that, you know, maybe one teacher 3.3 times 2,500 whatever isn't that much, but 140 teachers it sure is. So are they factoring that in to this as well?
I don't think we know the answer to that. It's a good point, though.
Any other questions? Last call. All right, I think that concludes our meeting tonight. Thank you everyone for taking time out of your evening to join us.
Good night, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Good night.